Get started. We want to welcome you here tonight to Golden Valley Historical Society for our March program. And but before I announce our speaker, before I introduce our speaker, I've got three announcements. Our program next month will be on April 10th, and it will feature local author Bob Madison, author of This Game is for the Girls, the 50-year story of Golden Valley girls softball. So mark your calendars for that, because that's going to be a really interesting program, and probably one that some of you may have taken part in at some point, or some of your family members might have. And he's going to not only give a little information about Golden Valley girls softball, but talk about how that develops teamwork and leadership and adds to our community. 2, April is Volunteer Month, and as an all-volunteer organization, GVHS is so grateful and honored to have such great volunteers that are on our board and open our museum on Saturdays. We are always looking for more volunteers, so we can thank you again in April, but we are looking for both general volunteers that might be a museum greeter. We train, it's easy, and board members. So please come see us afterwards if you're interested, or drop us a line. And then 3, we are recording. This is a new direction for us. We hope to be presenting our programs on our website soon, and we'll be we'll be presenting these programs on our website soon, so that people that can't make it here this evening or to programs that they've seen and want to share them will have that opportunity. All right, what's for tonight? For Women's History Month, we welcome Mary Agnes Rattel, who is the Interim Executive Director of the Edina Historical Society. And Mary Agnes was raised in Edina and is a graduate with a Master's in Art History and Museum Studies from the University of St. Thomas. And she's going to be speaking to us tonight on the image of the 1950s housewife, which is a contradiction of opulence and restriction. And I think that is going to sum up what Mary Agnes is going to present to us tonight, but in greater depth than that. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm mic'd up. Can you guys hear me? Is that good? Okay, perfect. All right, yeah, thank you so much for coming. I'm just going to get started. So, the title of my talk is More Than a Housewife, the 1950s Housewife in Post-War Magazine Illustration. The 1950s housewife has been a highly contentious image within American visual culture, used to embody both the hopes of post-war economic opulence and the limitations of the domestic sphere that second-wave feminism pushed against. Influential feminists, such as Betty Friedan, observed the grip that the housewife image had on post-war culture, cementing this archetype as emblematic of the experiences of middle-class white women of the period and the social pressures that they faced. Although the image of the dainty, glamorous 1950s housewife was a mainstay of illustrated media, the representation of this archetype was far more complex. To explore these nuances, this presentation will present 2 categories of magazine illustration: advertising illustration and parenting column illustration. Although advertising illustration perpetuated an idealized conception of the housewife, parenting articles provided an opportunity for illustrators to explore a more realistic portrayal of American housewives. Illustrators Lorraine Fox and Howard Sparber took full advantage of this opportunity, creating illustrations that depict the ups and downs of domestic life and portray the housewife as an active participant in the developing field of child psychology. This presentation will draw from Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, to bring attention to the main critiques of the portrayal of the 1950s housewife. A staunch critic of domestically based femininity, Friedan argued that American media pushed an idealized conception of housewifery onto women. Friedan claims that the content of women's magazines are vapid, further claiming that domestic work itself is pure drudgery and the source of a woman's discontent. She's a little bit dramatic, as you will see as we go on. However, the work of advertising researchers such as Edward Bernays and Ernest Dichter reframed these critiques, demonstrating how this idealization was merely a marketing strategy. As for magazine illustration, both Fox and Sparber portray a differing perspective, presenting a grounded depiction of housewifery that plays on the imperfections of domestic life, while also uplifting the domestic work. Here, the housewife is portrayed as an individual who uses her skill to actively engage in the field of child psychology, establishing herself as an intellectual in her own right. The housewife was a prominent archetype within advertising illustration, often appearing on the pages of women's magazines during the post-war period. These advertisements showed housewives across America how the period's growing consumer culture could ensure the comfort and cleanliness of their homes. Influential advertising researchers, such as Edward Bernays, used Freudian theory to more directly appeal to the middle class, seeking to uncover their subconscious needs and desires. At the center of these targeted advertisements was the housewife, using her glamour and can-do spirit to highlight the joys of middle-class living. Through heavy use of housewife imagery, advertising illustration created an idealized image of the highly domestic, middle-class lifestyle, and stripped the housewife of any personal identity, reducing her to merely a background for the latest product. After World War II, the United States experienced massive economic growth, accompanied by a subsequent growth in the middle class and a population growth. With this newfound wealth, more Americans could support larger families on one income. The advertising industry gained a stronger foothold in American culture, capitalizing on the decade's rapidly growing consumer culture. Appealing to this growing, moneyed middle class, advertisers represented an idealized version of middle-class life, with the perfect one-income home acting as the stage for the latest products. By doing this, advertisers not only sold the product, but also fostered the hope that consumers could attain the ideal middle-class life through consumption. At the heart of this was the housewife, symbolizing the comfort and luxury of the post-war middle class. A high-C advertisement featured in the Ladies' Home Journal in May 1950 encapsulates this phenomenon, framing the product within the context of a happy household. The scene opens on a cheerful domestic scene. A housewife, donning a frilled apron, pours a glass of high-C orangeade, surrounded by her daughter and son. The scene evokes a sense of elegant domesticity, with the figures depicting a happy, all-American family. The housewife is placed in the center, bringing particular attention to her role in the creation of this ideal. This address frames the housewife as the main supporting character to high-C's leading role in the advertisement, targeting the advertisement's expected audience, the middle-class housewife. In The Feminine Mystique, Friedan discusses at length the significant role that the housewife plays in advertising. From household appliances to convenience foods, the housewife is a reoccurring character, used to promote the next novel commodity. She states that due to the housewife's integral role in consumerism, advertising depended on the image of the domestic woman. Friedan continues to argue that since advertisers depended on the housewife to sell products, they promoted the housewife role itself in order to maintain their consumer base. Despite her often hyperbolic language, Friedan's claims indicate the development of advertising techniques during the post-war period. During this period, advertisers began to lean on psychological phenomena to appeal to the public. One of the pioneers of this psychological approach was Edward Bernays, who was instrumental in popularizing Freudian psychology in the United States throughout the 20th century and intersecting it with marketing. The nephew of Sigmund Freud himself, Bernays was deeply influenced by his uncle's theories of psychoanalysis, developing a particular interest in the subconscious and its impact on a person's decision-making. Bernays privileged appealing to the subconscious desires of the consumer over the practical use of the product, and used in-depth knowledge of the consumer's psychology to persuade them into adhering to certain ideas and actions. Eventually, he dubbed this persuasion-driven advertising method as the engineering of consent. Bernays' work continued into the mid-20th century, with his methods taking a further grip on American advertisers. Other market researchers, such as Ernest Dichter, adhered to this appeal to subconscious desires. Known for his work with General Mills and General Foods, Dichter believed that in addition to subconscious desires influencing consumers, quote, products consumed in public, cars, clothing, and even houses, were more about status than anything else, unquote. Along with other market researchers, Dichter promoted motivation research among advertisers, aiming to further understand what motivated consumers to buy certain products and partake in certain actions. During the 1950s, motivation research boomed within the advertising industry, with different schools of thought emerging and coming into conflict with each other. Dichter, however, remained a leading researcher in the field. Similar to Bernays, he emphasized the emotional experience of a product, seeking to appeal to subconscious desires. Dichter used psychoanalytic research methods in an attempt to reveal the subconscious desires of consumers. Although neither Bernays nor Dichter advised on High C's advertising department, his overall influence on advertising techniques is palpable, focusing less on simply informing the public of the function of a product, but more on how the product was meant to make them feel. Returning to the High C advertisement, although the advertisement's claims of the health benefits are prominent, the imagery itself suggests something beyond the promises of nourishment. With the housewife at the center of the image, surrounded by her 2 children, the advertisement suggests the human desire for familial connection. The son and daughter gather around their mother as she pours the drink into tall glasses, turning what would otherwise be a mundane task into a moment of togetherness. This ultimately portrays High C as the harbinger of domestic contentment. The centralizing of the housewife is key to this message. With the housewife partaking in the act of pouring the drink, the advertisement further suggests that she is the primary actor in bringing this product into the house and allowing it to bring household harmony. The role of the daughter in this image further emphasizes the housewife's role. In a book entitled Food is Love, Advertising and Gender Roles in Modern America, author Catherine Parkin observes how daughters in food advertising take on the role of housewives in training. Daughters are depicted directly assisting their mothers in the use of the advertised product, whereas the sons, if portrayed at all, were rarely shown assisting in housework. This contrast between the son and daughter dynamic is clearly depicted in the High C advertisement. While the daughter dutifully stands beside her mother with a tray of glasses, the son stands in the background as he helps himself to a glass of the beverage. Similar to the mother, the daughter's eyes are fixed on the product, whereas her brother's attention is focused on the satisfaction of his thirst. Not only does this create a heavily gendered dynamic, directly associating women with the labor behind domestic work and men with the fruits of that labor, but it also depicts young girls as potential housewives, with their attention transfixed on domestic products. This brings further attention to the housewife, and by extension the product itself, portraying it as something to aspire to. Although this heavy emphasis on the housewife, the advertisement targets housewives specifically, suggesting that through their consumption of High C orangeade, they can be agents in the health and happiness in their households, as well as role models for their daughters. By depicting their products in a domestic context, companies play on subconscious fears of social embarrassment, suggesting that households can fulfill their desires for belonging through corporate consumption, and that housewives in particular play an integral role in this. A Chevrolet advertisement featured in the September 1954 issue of the Ladies' Home Journal also reflects these ideas, expressing them through an emphasis on aesthetic beauty and elegance. An elegantly clothed woman exchanges glances from her place in the driver's seat of her new Chevrolet with her daughter in the back seat. The scene embodies a sense of domestic bliss and elegance, with the relationship between the mother and daughter centralizing familial bonds and their fashionable dress evoking luxury. The overall effect of the image is immersive, showing viewers the kind of lifestyle that they could have if they purchased a Chevrolet. This reflects Dichter's aforementioned belief that shopping spoke to the consumer's desire for social approval and status. The text of this advertisement reinforces this desire for higher social standing, focusing on the quality and aesthetic beauty of the interior design of the vehicle. It says, quote, "Fabrics you'd find only in much higher priced cars are lavishly used throughout Chevrolet's interiors in rich harmony of color that is pleasing to the eye, and comfort goes hand in hand with all this beauty, making Chevrolet one car that's really part of gracious living," unquote. Dressed in fine fabrics and harmonious colors herself, the housewife embodies every quality ascribed to Chevrolet's interior design and the social significance of car ownership. During this period, the ownership of passenger cars sharply increased, and car manufacturers created striking, aesthetically pleasing designs to appeal to the status-seeking middle class. By reflecting both the luxury of the Chevrolet and the social perception of car ownership, the lifestyle of the housewife, an idealized middle-class existence, becomes a product alongside the Chevrolet. Through purchasing a Chevrolet, the consumer not only gains a stylish car that could become the envy of her neighbors, but the consumer joins in the ranks of the idealized middle class. Through appealing to subconscious desires for social belonging and approval, both the High C and Chevrolet advertisements ultimately act as advertisements for the post-war middle-class lifestyle. Although these advertisements directly advertise for grocery items and vehicles, their larger message is one of social conformity. Through promises of domestic harmony and luxury, these advertisements imply that consumption will aid consumers in entering into an idealized state of middle-class opulence. Although domestic bliss is part of this post-war middle-class dream, the housewife and the advertised product embody a particular dynamic. Returning to Friedan's observation that the chief role of the housewife is to participate in consumer culture, the advertisements of this period ensure that the housewife is secondary to the product itself. Rather than expressing her own personality, she stands with her eyes transfixed on the product label. Similarly, the housewife, I'm going to show you the image before I start talking about it. Similarly, the housewife in the Chevrolet advertisement holds the product with her hand steadily fixed on the steering wheel. By holding the product, both housewives take on a role of personally supporting the product in its mission of household harmony. In this sense, the housewife acts as the supporting role to the product, ultimately bringing attention back to the product itself. As observed in a survey study of advertisements featuring depictions of mothers featured in the Berkeley Journal of Sociology, this was a common convention of advertisements of the 1950s. Through the housewife's literal and figurative uplifting of consumer products, the role of the housewife is centralized on the act of consumption itself, making it integral to her identity. Here, housewifery is defined by consumption, ultimately making consumption the purpose of middle-class living, and by extension, the housewife herself. An advertisement for Brillo soap pads from the June 1956 issue of Good Housekeeping reflects this, featuring a group of 6 housewives gleefully marveling over the wonders of the novel product. Large red letters reading "New Brillo soap pads" appears at the center of the ad, encircled by 6 smartly dressed housewives. Each housewife is transfixed on a particular feature of the soap pads, smiling and tossing up their arms in excitement over the quality and convenience of the product. 2 housewives at the top left hold either side of the giant soap pad, demonstrating the strength and practicality of the hemmed edges. At the right of the red text, another housewife holds a soap pad to her nose like a scented pillow, her eyes closed as she enjoys the scent. Every thought and action of each of these housewives is centered on the product, their entire personhood based on the consumption of Brillo soap pads. In the context of this advertisement, the role of housewifery is both defined by and based upon consumption, ultimately making consumption the purpose of middle-class living, and by extension, the housewife herself. However, the parenting columns featured in Red Book and the Ladies' Home Journal, written by Irma Simonton Black and Barbara Biber, respectively, portray a different reality. These columns provided a unique opportunity for illustrators to depart from the idealized forms seen in advertisements and explore the more complex aspects of home life. With Lorraine Fox providing illustrations for Irma Simonton Black's column in Red Book, and cartoonist Howard Sparber for Barbara Biber's column in the Ladies' Home Journal, both artists sought to complement the concepts explored in these columns. Utilizing heavily stylized illustration styles, Fox and Sparber created humorous and relatable illustrations that both comforted and humanized exasperated parents. Further, by working in tandem with the parenting articles themselves, these illustrations aided in making the complex concepts of child psychology more accessible, therefore helping the housewife to actively engage in recent developments in child psychology. Featured alongside an article entitled "Yes, Parents Resent Their Children," written by Irma Simonton Black and illustrated by Lauren Fox, this illustration presents a vastly different reality than the one curated by advertisements. Unlike the gleeful housewives that appeared beside the newest products, this woman stands in a vulnerable daze. As she watches her son crash his scooter into the clothesline, she tosses up her arms in frustration. This less than ideal scene is further expounded upon in the text. In the article, Black's main goal is to affirm mothers when they feel frustrated with their children. Rather than maintaining the image of the perfect mother, mothers should acknowledge the inevitability that they will sometimes resent their children. The realistic tone of this article is characteristic of both Black and Biber's work. A leading child psychologist, Biber championed an individualistic approach to child psychology. Black, who was a colleague of Biber, echoed these driving principles, offering to parents advice that provided insight into child development and processing. Receiving her PhD in 1942 at Columbia University, Barbara Biber had a keen interest in the intersection of child psychology and education. Biber's work is best characterized by her focus on individual development and her holistic focus on a child's developmental frame of reference. She also viewed play and exploration as key to healthy child development, as it taught children to have self-confidence and to reject conformity. Biber's approach is child-centric and individualistic. This mindset is reflected in her parenting column, humorously called "Bringing Up Parents." In her column from September 1948, Biber discusses the limits of child psychology books. She states that since each child is different, a book cannot act as a template for child development, but rather as a series of basic guidelines. Instead, she encourages parents to engage with the unique psychology of their own children. The accompanying cartoon by Howard Sparber further emphasizes this point. A father sits in an armchair reading a book on child psychology. The mother pushes a vacuum across the carpet and comments to her husband, "The section on discipline is missing. Junior ate it." Through this humorous comment, the scene demonstrates the limits of psychology texts. In this sense, the behavior of the individual child will perpetually challenge the parameters of child psychology, bringing new insight into psychological phenomena. Within their living room, the mother and father create their own psychological study. Aided with the guidance of psychology texts, the mother and father seek to understand their child through their own intellectual skills. With the illustration and Biber's text working together, they encourage and empower mothers to take a more active role in child psychology, giving them the resources that they need to perform their own study. Black's column from October of 1952 also reflects these ideas. In this column, Black utilizes Biber's concepts of exploration. In her column entitled "Let the Kids Cook," she outlines the importance of letting children assist in the kitchen. Black frames a housewife's perspective of the kitchen through a realistic lens, describing it as a necessary but largely unglamorous space. For children, however, it presents a unique opportunity for exploration and for the development of self-confidence. Similar to Biber, Black offers mothers reasonable yet realistic advice that makes mothers active participants in the psychological development of their children. Fox's illustration reflects these ideas, creating an image of a housewife finding contentment among the imperfection and disarray of her household. A housewife stands at her kitchen counter, casting a watchful eye on her two children. Rather than dividing the work in the kitchen by gender, as advertisements often did, Both the son and daughter actively participate in cooking, splattering batter as they work. Rather than centering housework around a specific polished ideal, Fox depicts it as an organic part of family life, complete with messiness, that each member of the household participates in. The housewife is a teacher helping her children develop skills in the culinary arts, as well as in self-confidence. Just like the housewife in Sparber's illustration, Fox's housewife is depicted as actively engaging with the mental development of her children, transforming her kitchen into a place of exploration and psychological development. In contrast to Friedan's assessment of domestic work, Fox and Sparber, alongside psychologists Black and Biber, reframe the housewife as skilled in her own right, using her intelligence to shape her family and household. In addition to emphasizing the psychological approaches of both Biber and Black, Fox and Sparber's artistic styles greatly contrast with the visual language posed by advertising illustration. Rather than utilizing a realistic style to portray an ideal, Fox and Sparber use a highly stylized, cartoonish style to reflect a more grounded depiction of housewifery. Although Fox's work is heavily stylized, her lack of realism contains a greater capacity to portray the highs and lows of domestic life. Although depicting widely relatable familial struggles, Fox's unrealistic style creates a separation between the viewer and the illustration. While advertising artists strove for realism, which immersed the viewer in an idealized image, Fox's work uses stylization to create a separation between the image and the viewer. This separation makes the discussion of the difficulties of home life more approachable. Rather than potentially reliving a stressful household moment, the viewer is able to look at the moment at a distance and consider its nuances. The viewer gains the satisfaction of feeling less alone in her struggles without being pulled into the exact moment of distress. Sparber creates a similar effect, utilizing humor to deflect the tension of daily household frustrations. In this illustration for Bringing Up Parents from October of 1950, Sparber demonstrates his ironic sense of humor. The illustration depicts a boy and a girl hiding beneath a piano as they watch their mother storm out of the room, carrying an armload of tools. The piano leg stands jagged and splintered, presumably after the two children mischievously carved it up themselves. The boy remarks, "She's just pretending not to like our carving. She's afraid we'll get conceited." A cartoonist by trade, Sparber uses the punchline and the imagery together to create a sense of dramatic irony. While the little boy's remark establishes one form of reality, the illustration itself portrays a completely different story. The housewife is an important figure creating the sense of irony. Rather than being the perfectly happy housewife, Sparber is unafraid in showing her anger. While the mother represents a reasonable reaction to the event, the two children represent a nonsensical conclusion to the incident. Here, Sparber uses humor to highlight the frustrations of the mother in an approachable manner. Similar to Fox, Sparber's cartoonish illustrations create a degree of separation between the viewer and the image. By adding humor, Sparber's illustrations offer the viewer a way to cope with household hardships. Rather than making the viewer feel overwhelmed by the event, Sparber invites the viewer to find the humor in the situation. Furthermore, by making the mother an active participant in the punchline, Sparber both affirms the housewife's frustrations and offers a constructive outlet for that anger. Rather than advocating for an idealized perception of housewifery, both Fox and Sparber acknowledge the hardship of domesticity. They portray housewives as active participants in the development of their children and as complex emotional beings. In conjunction with their accompanying articles, Fox and Sparber's illustrations were ultimately validating to exhausted housewives. Both columns stress the idea that home life, while good, is deeply complex and requires skill and intelligence to maneuver. When the feminine mystique first hit the shelves, it quickly became the primary commentary on the 1950s housewife and how she was depicted in popular media. Although many of Friedan's observations accurately describe the motivations behind some housewife imagery, her perspective is not without fault. As discussed in this presentation, advertising illustration cemented the idealized image of the gleeful and glamorous housewife in modern American consciousness. Advertising illustrations portrayed the housewife as largely one-dimensional, basing her identity on corporate consumption. With the illustrators used to accompany Black and Viber's parenting columns, illustrators Fox and Sparber created an emotionally complex portrayal of the housewife. Through earnestly portraying the highs and lows of home life, Fox and Sparber humanized the housewife and affirmed the skill required for domestic work. Although the housewife continues to be a contentious image, the visual culture of the 1950s demonstrated that the housewife was more than a naive, domesticated woman. The housewife represented the goals of a revitalizing American culture, the ideals of the growing middle class, and, most significantly, the emotional complexities of a real class of women seeking validation and respect. Thank you.
Jim, do you want to bring up the lights?
Yes, I
I
do.
can see you all.
And if we've got questions, I'll bring a mic to you so that we get them on the recording.
I thought of a question. Do I even need a mic?
You need
I don't even need a mic.
We'll give it to you anyway.
Do you ever go to gift shops like Patina,
Oh, yeah.
like that, and do you see a line of products that consist of refrigerator magnets, pot holders, dish towels, and they make use of these recycled images of these housewives from the 50s?
Yeah, I know what
Like
you're
you're
talking
showing.
about, yeah.
But they're always accompanied by some sort of snarky, off-color, or oftentimes profane saying.
Yes,
And they must sell the heck out of them.
yes.
Because they're all over the place, and I think it's just a very popular item. And I guess one of the reasons that they're that successful is that it's playing on the irony,
Yes.
okay? And in order to be successful and for there to be irony implicit in that is that at some point images and depictions like we're talking about here tonight stopped
Yeah.
in the commercial marketplace. And I was just sitting here thinking to myself, because I lived through this era.
Yeah.
I'm born in 1960. I had cans of High C in my kitchen. And you'd take the can opener and you'd punch a little hole on one side and then you'd open it up the whole way on the other side so that it wouldn't glug when you poured it and it would breathe. And I'm sitting here trying to think, when did these sorts of depictions of women like this go away?
Yeah.
Or is it that they've never really gone away and that there are still versions of it active in the marketplace today? And I recently saw a piece on the peanut butter wars. The various food companies jockeying for supremacy of the peanut butter market. And there was Skippy and others. And a new peanut butter product came along called Jif. And what was interesting about Jif was that it wasn't really made with peanut butter oil. It was made with hydrogenated vegetable oil and quite a few less peanuts. And it was theoretically honey flavored, which is just a euphemism for processed sugar. And I'll ask you to assume there was litigation about whether Jif could even call itself peanut butter. Eventually it was able to. But they needed a slogan. How are they going to convince America to buy Jif instead of Skippy and some of these other more popular brands? And the slogan, does anybody remember what the slogan was that they came up with? When I say it, I think you'll remember. Choosy mothers choose Jif.
Yeah.
Remember Choosy mothers choose Jif? That was ubiquitous. You would hear it all the time. And it was such, and it's a very simple slogan. There's not much to it. And when you did the TV commercials, they would get testimonials from moms. And it exploded. And before you knew it, Jif was number one. It was the top selling peanut butter in the United States because it appealed to moms and housewives. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, what era is that? Late 60s? Well into the 70s. Wasn't it?
I think so.
Yeah. And so we're sitting here talking about these images in the 50s. What's your take on when there was a sea change and these sorts of images just sort of went away and it wasn't as much of a technique anymore?
Yeah, that's a great question. Number one, I didn't even realize that there were peanut butter wars to begin with, so like hearing that piece of history is fascinating. I'll have to read into that. But no, I think that's a great question. I think a lot of it was things just kind of gradually evolved, and I think in some ways, some version of this image still exists. It's just kind of, like an animal adapting to its environment. It's kind of changed its spots a little bit. Where I think because we have more we tend to have more of a critical eye when we look at advertising. We kind of like to outsmart them and be like, well, I know what the real motivations are, or you're just trying to sell me something. And so I think when you look at advertisements today, they are trying to be a little bit more savvy and trying to not kind of portray, moms in the way that they were portrayed here, because again, we're being more critical and we have more of like a cultural awareness of how that image is idealization, how that's not real. But I think it's interesting how when I look at ads today, there is an element of they're trying to kind of pull on this like relatability more. And I'm trying to think of like a more grounded example, but I think when you look at ads now, you're seeing maybe, they're trying to sell a product to a mom, and maybe they'll show her being like a little bit more tired, or she'll be like a little bit, kind of this like controlled exasperation, and then, oh my gosh, here comes Sham Wow coming to help solve all her problems. So I think it's interesting to me because I think the image never fully went away. It's just the way that it's being portrayed has changed. And I would say that change, I would say that change probably happened around the 70s, around the 80s, where again, the second-wave feminism was kind of pulling in more and becoming more, less of a rebellion and more of something that was becoming more broadly accepted into women of that time. So the idea of like women having careers was becoming more and more cemented, more and more expected as time was going on. So I would kind of time that around the 70s and 80s. That would be my guess, but I would have to kind of look at the imagery itself and to kind of make sure that I'm not just guessing and that's actually for sure, but that would be my estimation. But that's a fantastic question. Yes.
Another question?
Yeah, please. Thank you. Since the 1950s, there's been, I guess, a moving away from this housewifery and such, but yet there's at any given time, there's always kind of the other side of it that is nostalgic for it and also feeling the value of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, is there really a good metric that kind of shows, when that pull back to that era and, to that feeling of the traditional nuclear family is stronger or weaker, or where it encompasses more of the population. Again, I think most people today believe that like the 2 household income is a necessity,
Right.
But again, there are some people who fight against that and try to reclaim the 1 household income. And so again, do you notice benchmarks of where it seems to have grown backwards, I guess, back to the more traditional?
So just to make sure I'm understanding the question properly, so are you asking that when do you think we start kind of looking at this, at what point did we start like looking at this period in more like a nostalgic lens or even as like an aspirational lens? So almost like, we have the 50s housewife and we've kind of evolved, and then now we're getting to the point where we're like, wait a second, we should go back kind of thing. Is that kind of more
Yes,
the
and
question?
and I feel
Just
like
making
there's
sure.
always a portion of society
Yeah.
that really wants to reclaim it,
Yeah,
and sometimes
yeah.
it's a large portion of society, sometimes it's a small portion of society.
Yeah, I think in some ways, when you kind of look throughout, I think there's always going to be some portion of society that will look at, again, like the one-income household with, you know, the husband who works, the wife who stays home. There'll always be some portion of society that favors that or looks at that or desires for that, but I have been noticing a lot more now. I think particularly with sort of the economy being what it is, I think the idea of having a one-income household for a lot of people is like, oh my gosh, wouldn't that be amazing if we could do that? Like that was, why did we stop aspiring to that sort of thing? So I've definitely been noticing, even like among people my own age, like really desiring that, and how having one income household is extremely aspirational, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that economically that's not the most realistic for a lot of people. And so I think, again, having a one income household that then comes with this certain level of luxury and living of, you know, we are privileged enough that we can have one spouse staying at home. So I think it is really interesting. I think particularly now, at least for me, like I'm definitely seeing a lot of that nostalgia coming back and larger portions of society wanting that. But I think in some way, nostalgia for it never fully went away. Because even when you have people who maybe grew up with that, they look at these images and they're like, oh my gosh, that's my mom or that's my grandma. There'll always be some level of nostalgia because it's associated with memory, right? So do you feel like
And people tend to look at the past more romantically, I suppose, than they do, and in a better light than it probably actually was.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, and I will admit, like, there's an element of like I see these images, like the images that I presented to you, and it's like, you know, I see the housewife in her apron, and I'm just like, wow, that's a great. I would love to have that apron. That's fantastic. She looks great. So yeah, absolutely.
It seems like it's primarily a visual thing.
Mm-hmm.
And although I'm sure if you went back and did research on radio, it's depicted audibly on the radio in some manner. But for me, growing up during that era, more than the magazine advertisements, is television.
Oh yeah.
The shows that you would watch when you turn on, we only had 3 channels, and it was Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver, and all these situation shows that depicted mom a certain way.
And then
Eventually that changed too. I think around the time of, say, like a writer like Norman Lear
yeah.
and All in the Family, when the shows started to reflect some of the social changes that were actually taking place in the country, the other types of depictions of moms on TV it kind of dropped away.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is an interesting observation because, yeah, when I was first developing the concept behind this talk, one of the things that I was really kind of responding to in a way was, again, how we, particularly with just like the prominence of like TV at that time and how we still remember that and how we tend to look to that as like an accurate representation of like the lives of women, and to some degree it's like really kind of the like stereotype of that was what existed, but not necessarily that wasn't necessarily the lived reality for all women, or even women who were of that class, were of that role, didn't necessarily have that kind of like perfect life. Like I think about my own grandmother, how she raised her family in a very like blue collar environment and in Patchogue, Long Island, among like car mechanics and such. And she was, you know, a housewife, took care of the house, but she also like made dresses for people. Like she was a very extremely tough lady, and she hated the Donna Reed show. She hated it because she was like, that's not real life. Like, what is this show about? And so I think it is interesting that when you look at that, because yeah, I definitely agree with your point where it's like you see the advertisements, but then the kind of that depiction is also in television. It's also definitely in radio. I grew up in a very nerdy family, and we listened to like old radio shows from that era, and how again you also see that depiction too of the housewife that's very similar. So it is really interesting how much that archetype was permeated throughout the culture.
It was basically what you said, and just the Donna Reed show, and then the commercials would be the same as your magazines, but they'd be the action. So
Yeah.
that was fed too. And the radio would be the same thing, it might be the commercials, you couldn't see it, but your ears would do it.
Yeah, so it's all.
So you
kind
were
of-
bombarded with it, but then I was thinking, you are with your phones now too, because you got ads coming
Yeah.
that way, so.
Yeah, or even one of the things that is wild now, I mean, this is just how much advertising has developed as a medium in and of itself, is that now, like when you have social media, like you have Instagram, for example, and you have like maybe like Instagrammer whose content you watch, and you're like, oh, you know, this is like a really nice, like a woman who makes like sourdough bread or something, and you're watching this video of her making the bread, and you realize, oh, she's sponsored by King Arthur Flour. Well, that's really interesting. I've been bamboozled into watching an ad. How dare they? So I think it's really interesting when you see that, because it's becoming like more sneaky. And I think too, when you have that added layer of somebody who's like, let's say like a lifestyle creator online, and you kind of follow them because they have this really interesting lifestyle, and then you realize, oh, they're also using their own personal lifestyle as far as we know. We don't know how much they actually live like that as they depict online, but how they're using a perception of their lifestyle to also advertise. So it almost like feels like a more ingrained version of the ads that we have here. So it's really, yeah, I mean, I think bringing up phones now and how we're bombarded with ads constantly. And it was the same back then, although probably now a bit more so.
I was at a women's college back in the 60s when Betty Friedan wrote her book. And I remember she came to my college to speak to us, and the takeaway of her message was, you should not be training as nurses, you should be training as doctors. And I'm wondering if there was, I know that her book was one of the primary forces behind the women's movement of the late 60s. And I wonder if there was an active pushback by advertisers against that kind of an attitude.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting observation, because in a way where it's like they're trying to, because again, like what is the advertiser's main goal? Like their goal is to maintain their consumer base, and so if you have this consumer base that is stay-at-home wives, right, housewives, you don't necessarily want to encourage that, because then you lose a whole consumer base. Now obviously everybody needs to eat, everybody needs Windex, but at the same time, you are kind of, I think, by, in a way it's like what you're saying is that, did advertisers like double down in these kinds of very like domestically based ads, kind of in response to that? I think that is a really interesting question, because I think I would have to kind of, again, sort of see at what point the women's movement was really taking off and how the ads reflected that, because I think at some level advertisers did have to realize that they had to evolve to some degree, and I think you do see that. But at the same time, I think there is an element to advertising where they were very reluctant to let go of that, because again, you have to reroute, you have to change the visual language that you're using that has so far worked, and you're trying to maintain a certain level of your consumer base. So I think that's kind of my estimation. But yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. That's really cool that you got to see Betty Friedan like speak in person too. That is, yeah, that is really cool.
I thought of a good example to answer your question, I think. See if people recognize this one. Remember Virginia Slims cigarettes? Their slogan? You've come a long way.
Yeah.
Remember that one?
No? Yes?
Yes, I'll make it quick, I promise.
No.
I think to correlate all three of those things, I think what you see is the change in the way advertisers advertised. It was a lot less direct, and to your point earlier, it evolved. So when you watched a classic game show, because that's the one that you generally see those advertisements still on, when you go from the black and white versions of the 1950s what is it? Let's not like let's make a deal. It's got the wheel.
Truth of consequences?
No,
Wheel of Fortune.
not Wheel of Fortune. Drew Carey now hosts
Price is
it.
Right.
The Price is Right.
Price is Right.
The very early Price is Right. They actually had like the soap, like or Spick and Span sponsored it, and it was on the actual.
Set and,
Yes, it was on the set.
yep.
Advertising changed, and you saw a lot more of the advertisers advertising at the end. So they had to get sneaky in the way they actually did it. So they had to evolve their advertising to put things at the end, sponsor giveaway packages that came at the end of the show if someone didn't win. So I think that's where you see a lot of that evolving. And then you were talking earlier about the change in television, and that really comes in around your point, the second wave of feminism starting in the 1970s when the rural purge happened, and you lost everything like Petticoat Junction, Leave It to Beaver, Andy Griffith, Mayberry RFD, all of those types of television shows, and they were replaced with game shows.
Gosh.
That is fascinating insight. Like, I hadn't really thought about how the types of shows that were also being shown, how that also was part of that change. That's fascinating. That is fascinating insight. Thank you.
I have a quick
Just someone back there.
comment or question. The ad that you showed with the mother, the Chevrolet ad,
Yeah.
with the mother with their child in the car, I noticed that in a few commercials now, you will see a child in a car, and it usually has to do with the safety of the vehicle and such. You know, obviously we do not have replacement birth rate anymore. The vast majority of car commercials that I notice are not domesticity at all. They're all about, okay, let's go out and have a good time in the evening, you know?
Yeah.
It's, you know, 20-year-olds going out to a club, whatever, and having fun. It's
Yeah.
not about the nuclear family anymore, for the most part.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because yeah, I'm even thinking about like Volvo commercials and how it's just like, oh, our car can drive in the mountains, because of course we're taking our cars in the mountains for some reason. And I think that is really interesting how I think they kind of shift from, you know, cars being a status symbol to, like, they're still a status symbol, but a lot of like the focus is on like the safety. Our car is so powerful. And I think in general, just cars back then, and someone who's more of like a car person can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in general people just weren't as concerned about like the safety of a car. And then now, as we kind of over time realize that, you know, driving can be quite dangerous, now people are very concerned about the safety sort of a thing, which is kind of ironic when you think about it too, where you think, you know, you see the ad of the Chevrolet and the child's in the car with no seatbelt, and you're thinking, well, wouldn't our primary concern be the child and the safety of the child? And then now you see car ads with like adults in the car, and you know, we're concerned about their safety, kind of a thing. And so I think that is really, really interesting. And I think part of it is, you know, I think now it's become more of an expectation that like every household has a car, right? Whereas back then it would have been more of like a status symbol, or you are in the ranks of a certain social class if you had a car, whereas now it's kind of given that most people have a car. So now I think advertisers need to focus on not just have a car and now you're cool, but have this specific car that has these specific features for your specific lifestyle, and then you'll be cool, because you know, maybe you want to be that kind of person who drives their car in the mountains, so of course you should get this specific kind of car. So I think that is a really interesting point, and again, how we have that evolution of like, what does it say about what does it say about society as a whole, but also what does it say about the product too, and how we view that product, and maybe the accessibility that we have to a specific product, and how does that reflect in the advertising. So that's a fantastic observation. Thank you.
This has been a really fascinating discussion. So we want to thank Mary Agnes tonight for this conversation, and for all of your questions and comments and joining in this conversation. I think you'll stick around for a little bit longer, just in case you come up with some other observation that you'd like to share with her. And know that she is one of our neighbor local history museums. So from the Edina Historical Society, if you haven't been, you should go. As local history sisters, so to speak, sister organizations, we like supporting local history, and our community's histories are important to understand and to share. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.